Hello, Elevate fans. This is Chris Morris, and welcome to the recording of the session on the Crusades, Wars of Religion or Armed Pilgrimages. I am recording these sessions after the fact, so we actually did these live on Saturday, May 4th, but the request was made to record them. So I'm re-recording them. Hopefully they will be better even than the live talks, and some may say that's a pretty low bar, but that's okay. Again, this season of Elevate Season 6, what we've done is we've gone back over the 40 sessions we've already had, 40 topics we've covered. We've had those that have been attending these sessions over the last couple of years vote on what they thought the best ones were. And this season, we're going through the top 8, 2 at a time. So the first Saturday of every month, we meet in the hall and we do a double feature, separated by about a 15-minute break, have a little coffee, some snacks, and go through what we're calling the best of Elevate. So this is the second talk that was done on Saturday, May 4th on the Crusades. The first one was on church scandal. You can feel free to watch that video as well. We publish it to the Elevate share. So if you're not sure where that is, and the individual who got you to this video can certainly get you to that one as well. Again, my name is Chris Morris. I am the primary speaker for the Elevate Talks, although occasionally we have a guest come in, which is always wonderful. I am the Director of Faith Formation at Holy Family Catholic Church in Orange, California, and thrilled to be so. And hopefully you will find them able to convey enough information that I can beg, borrow, and steal from others to make these talks interesting. So let us begin, as always, with prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, thank you so much for all that you've given us, but especially you've given us the great gifts of intellect, the great gift of intellect, and allow us to think through and understand and reason about events and data that we have, and let us really dig into what the Crusades were. So much misinformation has been put out there about them, and I want to make sure that we're all very clear that that misinformation is not worth the time or trouble to bother with, and that we really should focus on what they really were, what their highs were, what their lows were. There's certainly many of those to talk about. What we should be proud of with the Crusades, what we should be ashamed of in the Crusades, as Catholics and as humans, and really let us be able to share that information with others and do so in a way that can dispel some of the anger and frustration that people who are poorly informed often express relative to the Crusades. We ask this in your holy name. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So we're really going to talk about a number of items today. And the first thing I'm going to do is I want to talk about what the Crusades are in general. And every word that you see coming up on the screen is actually a word that is an apt description of the Crusades. So everything from wasteful and ignorant and failure and treacherous and ill-conceived and scandalous and savage, those all fit, okay? As do glorious and fruitful and virtuous and honorable and necessary and unifying and impactful and bravery. Those fit as well. And the reason that you have such a dichotomy, how you can have so many things that seem to be on polar opposites used to describe the same series of events, is the Crusades have many causes. The Crusades, there are more than one. That's why we use the plural, Crusades. They're individual events that each have their own character. But most importantly, the key to understanding the Crusades is to understand that they are very much embroiled with both faith and politics. And those two things can often bring about some really unusual and sometimes shameful activities. And in this case, it brought back some unusual, shameful, glorious, wasteful, insignificant, savage, honorable, virtuous, fruitful, scandalous, and treacherous activities. So let's talk about how that's possible. So we're going to start off with some popular misconceptions, give you a little background about what was happening right before the Crusades that will tie in very closely to a little perspective on the geography and religions of the age. We'll talk about what really led to the Crusades, the shakeup in Christendom, We're talking about the First and Second Crusades, which were really the high point of the crusading period, for all intents and purposes, and then the downfall from the Third and the Fourth and the Fifth and the Sixth Crusades, which are crusades by Pope and Crusades of St. Louis, the King of France, who tried to do something on his own that failed miserably. So we're talking about those. We're to talk about how following the Crusades, there was really a complete return to the pre-crusading situation, at least geographically, which just shows you about some of the folly of the Crusades. And then it became an actual worse situation where the Christendom was put on in a very tenuous defensive position. And if it wasn't for a couple of key battles, predominantly at Malta, and then later at Lepanto, and then later still at Vienna, it could have been the end of Christianity, and that would have been a direct result of the crusade, strangely enough. So, and then we'll end with some conclusions. So let's talk about the popular misconceptions. And one of the things I do for all of these talks is I produce a set of notes that are very detailed, okay? So someone who comes to these talks, these are always handed out to those who attend in person. And the idea is this way you don't have to take notes, because I'm actually taking the notes, everything that's on my slides, which tend to be fairly detailed, and reproducing them in notes form, and sometimes adding some additional data. For example, this timeline I give you here in these notes, and some of these maps and things, which aren't things that are readily available to you normally. But and I'll also put in recommendations. For example, at the end of this one, I do recommend two very good books by Steve Weidenkopf and Hilaire Belloc that are very good. Steve Weidenkopf, his book about the Crusades in general is fantastic. Hilaire Belloc's book, it really focuses on the background to the Crusades and then the First Crusade itself, which, quite frankly, if you're going to look at any crusade, it's probably the only one really worth looking at individually. But again, he does a really good job as an eminent historian of presenting the reality of the Crusades. So give you a couple of things there. I think I give you a couple of YouTube videos in these notes as well, which are interesting, one of which will be used in the presentation. But one of the things I talk about are those misconceptions. So maybe we just use the notes to go over the misconceptions to get you used to looking at the notes. So, first off, a lot of people are like, oh, the Crusades, they were wars of unprovoked aggression, of these massive Christian armies against a defenseless and docile Islamic and peace-loving people. Yeah, that's not true. Okay, in fact, far from it. The Seljuk Turks were the key players to which Christendom was fighting in the Crusades. And these were not a peaceful and gentle people. These were brutal killers, the best brutal killers in the world, as a matter of fact, and actually changed warfare as we know it because of some of the tactics that they created and defined. So despite overwhelming power and size differences, their tactics were so powerful they were able to wipe out much larger armies, much more well-armed and reinforced armies. And these were, again, anything but unprovoked. There was a series of provocations, and you will see what those are shortly, but I want to dispel that one. You also often hear they're motivated primarily by greed, and you hear what's called the first son syndrome. So the idea that first sons in Europe were given all the family inheritance because they were the first sons, which left the second and third sons with nothing. So the second and third sons went after war looking for wealth and conquest and land. Wrong. Okay. Participating in a crusade was an incredibly expensive endeavor for those lords and knights, those second and third sons. But they weren't the ones that went. It was primarily the first sons that went. The ones that had the most to lose were the ones that lost the most. And so, again, not motivated by greed. It truly was. The Crusades truly were motivated by religious faith and honor, okay? Things that are hard for us to understand today because we live in a very different context. But in pre-nation state Europe, and this is pre-nation state Europe, There's no France or Germany or England or the Nordic countries as we know them today. No Germany as we know it today. There were Germanic peoples, there were Gaulish French people, there were English peoples, but we're talking about multiple small kingdoms and loose confederations at best, and more often than not, warring confederations. So the allegiance wasn't to a country. You had an allegiance to your faith because that was the primary glue of the time. So again, greed, no. Faith, honor, yes. The liberation of Jerusalem was an incredibly bloody battle, left blood ankle deep. Every single person and animal was wiped out. Well, it was incredibly bloody, no doubt about that, as all sieges of all cities were, because the rule of war at the time was you would approach a city, surround it with an army, and make it an offer, saying, look, we're willing to walk away if you give us X. And if you gave them X, the army that had sieged the city would indeed walk away. That's how it worked. But if you didn't give them X and said that you wanted to fight, the understanding was you were going to fight to the death. And if they breached the walls and entered the city, they had the right and the responsibility of wiping out the threat of anyone in that city that could potentially repel them or revolt against them down the road. So you need to understand context. You also need to understand that, you know, the idea of blood running an ankle deep is a little bit of a hyperbole, but that's okay. We use hyperbole all the time. As a matter of fact, my favorite baseball team just crushed the Houston Astros yesterday by a score of 9-4. Now, did they literally crush them? No, but that's what we use. It's called hyperbole. We use it all the time in descriptions around sports and war, and any sort of conquest in game. We use it. So again, don't be disturbed by that. The Crusades were colonial enterprises. Actually, they weren't. We had no intention, Christendom had no intention of taking over those lands. It was really about freeing those lands so that those people that were on pilgrimages could freely visit the most holy religious sites in the world and do so without being, killed. Okay. So that was the primary reason for these things. Colonialism came after the Crusades. So after the Crusades, and the failure of the Crusades and the rising of Islam under the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire's near total takeover of the known civilized world, then you saw the colonialism as the nation states in Europe had formed, and they decided to begin to take pieces of other countries to expand their territory. But that has nothing to do with the Crusades. That was anywhere from 500 to 800 years later, but it often gets lumped together. And then there wars of forced conversion, and they weren't, quite frankly, on either side. Christendom had no desire, no widespread desire anyway, with the exception apparently of St. Francis, and we're talking about him, to convert the people of Islam. They didn't think it could be done, quite frankly. And the people of Islam just wanted the Christians out of their hair. And really, they tried several times to destroy Christianity, not because of Christianity, because they wanted to spread Islam. And they almost succeeded twice, okay? But it wasn't about forced conversion. It was about territory, okay? And then the last one, these are the source of modern East-West tensions. It was the Crusades that allow us to have the radical Islamic extremists that we see today who are involved in terrorist activities around the world. Those aren't true believers in Islam. Those are radical Islamists. And again, hopefully you can differentiate between the two. And quite frankly, while some of them may point to the Crusades, it's because they're idiots, okay? Islamic history rarely talks about the Crusades because they were a much bigger deal for Christians than they were for Islam. Islam actually had bigger issues that they were dealing with, both internally and externally. And for most of the Crusades, the Crusades were more of an annoyance or a disruption, keeping the Islamic military groups from their true mission, which was actually subduing each other and trying to unify into one Islamic nation, which did happen to some extent through the Ottoman Empire and the Seljuk Turks. And I'm not sure what just happened. Oh, I must have pushed a button there. Okay. So anyway, those are the misconceptions. I want to make sure you're clearly aware of those. And I think I did cover all of those. So let's continue moving forward. A little bit of background. So what you're seeing here is an image of Constantinople, what is now modern day Istanbul. But this is about what it would have looked like in and around the time of the Crusades. So you're talking about a major city on the Bosphorus River. You can see a couple of major elements of construction, a large fort on the left-hand side of the screen, a large arena for chariot races, a very famous one, by the way, in the dead center of the screen. Matter of fact, that arena once had the famous four horses of the Cathedral of St. Mark in Venice that resided over it. The Venetians stole it from Constantinople, those four horses. So those four horses over St. Mark's in Venice, if you ever go, actually were part of one of the debacles of the Crusades, one of the great debacles associated with the Fourth Crusade, when Christians actually fought each other in a crusade. And Constantinople, the largest Christian city in the world, was ransacked, and many of its beautiful pieces of art and anything of any value was stolen and brought to various places in Europe. But anyway, 4th century. The Roman Empire in the West, so in Europe, was collapsing or was on the, on its downward swing. The Western Emperor Constantine decided to move the seat of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, built a new city. 5th century, the Western Roman Empire did indeed fall, so it was a good move. The Eastern Roman Empire, now, adopting the name of the Byzantine Empire, remains. So the Roman Empire didn't fade away when Rome fell, and the Vandals and the Visigoths took over that part of Europe. It still was alive and well and very powerful in the form of the Byzantine Empire centered around Constantinople. 6th century, let me take a sip of my coffee, please. The 6th century Christendom was pretty much the near universal religion outside of the Orient. As a matter of fact, within Christendom, because they didn't know that there was other parts of the world, they had figured that everybody was Christian, okay? That we had gotten the good news out to everyone. We had fulfilled Jesus's command to go make disciples of all nations. And, while some people still rejected the faith, the vast majority of people in the world, as of the 6th century, at least the known world, to these people, were Christian. So it was a very, joyous time, because we felt we had completed the mission, but we did not realize that there were still 2/3 of the world that existed we did not know of. And our joy was short-lived anyway, because in the 7th century, we saw the rise of Islam. And this was like something that had never been seen before. So Islam is an interesting religion founded by what they consider the Prophet Muhammad. No basis for considering him a prophet. There's no signs he performed or signs were performed in his name that would indicate that God had any special message for him, but he did convince people God did, and created a religion which really takes the best aspects of Christianity and Judaism, puts them together, and then eliminates all the really hard teachings. So a very simple, fundamental religion built around the worship of the one true God. So the one true God of Israel and Christendom is the one true God of Islam, although Islam has a different understanding of that one true God. But Islam rose and quickly spread. Matter of fact, it spread faster than any religion and any force that history had seen to this point. Matter of fact, by the 8th century, so within a century, most of Eastern Christendom was gone. So Islam had spread throughout the Middle East, Northern Africa, and into Eastern Europe, actually, at that point. So sort of a crescent around the Mediterranean. And that whole area that I just described was the center of Christianity for, much of the first millennium. So it basically wiped out the traditional center of Christianity within 100 years, which is just unbelievable. By the 9th century, the Holy Roman Empire reestablished itself back in the West under Charlemagne. So this was a big deal because the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, was under severe assault, being now surrounded by Islam. So the Holy Roman Empire reestablished in the West under Charlemagne. Nations, inklings of convergence at about this point. In the 10th century, what you had in the East was a Muslim world that did share common language, or at least common languages, based on the Hermetic languages, and a religion, but they were still very much a series of independent territories with different leadership, and they were sort of in a position of just warring with each other back and forth. And it was an unusual situation, and maybe I can use one of the maps in the handout to talk about it. Let me just see if I can do that. Yeah, okay. An unusual situation. We use this map. Yeah, okay, first map. So Islam, pretty much all this purple, okay? So you can see Islam's everywhere. There's Constantinople, so the biggest Christian city stuck right on the edge of Islam, all right? Which gives you a reason why there was a reestablishment of the Roman Empire over here with Charlemagne. But here's the interesting thing about Islam. So you have Egypt and Africa down here. You have what is today modern Turkey, but back then was the Seljuk Empire and the Ottomans eventually up here. And then you have this thin strip of land that today we call Israel here. And then here you have what is today modern Jordan, but what you really have out here is the Arabian Desert, where no human can live, okay? So in order to get from the north to the south, you had to go through this small strip of land, which became very valuable. So if you need to go from Africa to Asia, you had to go through Israel. If you need to go from the Far East to Europe, you had to go through Israel, okay? So again, this strip of land became very important politically, became very important economically, and it served as the link between the northern Islamic groups and the southern Islamic groups. And as long as that link established, there was a hope that one day they could be unified. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through some more of these materials. So 10th century, Islam powerful, but divided. 11th century, that's when the Seljuk Turks dominated North and East Islam. So back to that map, Seljuk Turks came out of what would have been the Russian steppes. So these are not ancestors, but successors of the Huns, come out of the steppes and sweep their way through what is today Turkey. And they very rapidly take over most of the northern area and most of the eastern portion of what was Islam at the time, okay? So important that you're aware of that. And let's see, where am I at here? There we go, all right? So again, today we're used to this picture. This is a picture of the major religions of the world, color-coded. Purple is Christianity, green is Islam. Hinduism, big in India, so this orange chunk here. Hinduism and Buddhism, obviously big in Southeast Asia and northern China. Obviously, atheism, very big. Judaism, you can't even see how small that is, the blue here in Israel. But again, this gives you a sense of where we are today. But let's talk about how we got here. Because it's interesting, if you look at the development of religion, say from the beginning of this, the modern period until the current day, you may be surprised to see how fast Islam spread and how it almost completely dominated the known world. Hopefully you can hear this as well, and I'll try to annotate a little bit as we go. So we're in the early 1st century. Christianity is now starting to spread with Jesus's death and resurrection. You can see as we get past 100, first 70 years, pretty good spread. We get to about 150. The spread starts to increase in rapidity. We're at year 250 now. still spreading. So after 250 years, we made some really good progress. Constantinople becomes the center of the Roman Empire. Christianity continues to spread. We're in the year 500 now. You can see that spread is very uniform. We're rapidly approaching 600. Boom, there's Islam. And watch how fast it spreads from 600 to about 700 right there. And you can see it's starting to take over pieces of Christianity in Southwest Europe. Took over most of Northern Africa, which was the most populous portion, all of the Middle East, the Near East, and Far East. And that was before the year 1000. So then there was some pushback. You can see that Islam is moving closer and closer to Constantinople. The Crusades occur and reestablish a Christian foothold in what is today Israel, but you can see that foothold quickly evaporated and eventually was destroyed and wiped out. Meanwhile, in southwestern Europe, Islam is getting pushed back. But again, the Ottoman Empire pushes forward in southeast Europe and is also now pushing downward in Africa. So you can see it's getting to the point where everything is almost Islam with the exception of the southwestern and central European countries by 1750. And that's when the Ottoman retreat begins because of a series of the decisive battles. It did leave some remnants of Islam in its place in southern Europe. But all of a sudden, you start to see that establishment of what is now today's map of the world that's dominated by Christianity with a massive Muslim footprint in the midst of it. Okay, so hopefully that'll give you a sense. Don't need to watch that again. That'll give you a sense of Islam's spread and the pushback against Islam from the Christian countries once that spread started to really threaten the lifeblood of Christendom. So I share this because it's important. It's important background to understand where we are in the world. And if you can think back to that visual map as it changed, right around the year 1000, Islam had done some major damage to Christianity. But, strangely enough, Christendom wasn't overly concerned until the year 10,009. And, Islam had taken Jerusalem centuries before. So Jerusalem had fallen in the 8th century. So now we're in the 11th century. So it wasn't as if Christendom was overly concerned about the fall of Jerusalem because the Islamists were pretty good about religious tolerance at the beginning. And they were okay with Christians coming to pilgrimage sites in their territory because, quite frankly, they brought money and things to the territory for trade. So there was sort of just an acceptance. Okay, this is how it is. As long as we can keep visiting our holy sites, we're good. And then what we ended up happening is we had a caliph in that northern area of the Muslim world, the Seljuk Turks. And again, the Muslim world was still pretty separated north and south. He actually destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Israel. And that woke people up because that came out of nowhere. And he did that purely for religious reasons. And then the same Seljuk Turks began harassing pilgrims to the Holy Land. And pilgrims wouldn't be just like you and your family going on vacation. It would be caravans of people. And we had a real tragedy of a massacre of about 12,000 in a caravan led by the Bishop of Bamberg from Germany on Good Friday, no less, in the year 1065. So we had Islam taking out the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most holy site in all of Israel for Christians. And then this massacre of the 12,000 pilgrims. And that was followed soon after by the Battle of Manzikert, where the Byzantine army came out of Constantinople and was attacking the Turks for defensive purposes. It was a defensive offensive. But the king of Istanbul, the emperor of Istanbul at that point, of Constantinople at that point, was a little inept, and he ignored the knowledge that had been gained fighting the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks, they would fight from very small but rapid horses, and they would attack you in an arc, the Arc of the Crescent, and they would fire their arrows from the sides of their horses and then boom, be gone before you could fire back. And they were very good at this. And the only way to defeat them with a large traditional army was to make it so they couldn't retreat. So you had to back them into an area where they could not retreat. And that's not what the Byzantine emperor did in this case. He went out with his very large and heavy fortified army, which had never lost. Okay, the Byzantine Empire now is a half a millennium old, and they'd never lost a battle. So he was um, a little bit blown away by his own history, or by the own history of the Byzantine Empire. But he goes after the Turks in the open field, and it finally gets to him at Manzikert in the desert when the Byzantine Empire realized they've traveled too far, they're exhausted, their supply lines are actually stretched too thin. They need to retreat, and you cannot retreat against the Seljuk army, because that's exactly what they want you to do. As you're retreating, they're attacking you in this crescent wave after wave after wave, and picking off whatever remnants you have at your hindquarters. And eventually they wiped out the entire Byzantine army. So those three things shocked the world, shocked the Christendom world in Europe. Here it is, the greatest Christian army ever assembled, undefeated, has just been wiped out. We have pilgrims being killed. We have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that no one forgot about being destroyed. And really, now we realize that if Constantinople falls, there's nothing holding back Islam from pouring into Europe from the east. So we've been fighting it well in the West, and we have a restricted access point in the West. But if they can open up the East and come through the East, there'd be nothing to slow them down into Europe. So it was a nervous time. And that's when we had a new Byzantine emperor take the throne. Okay, Alexis I. And he actually wrote to the Pope and said, "You got to help me. I'm in dire straits here." And the Pope loved this because we had just experienced the split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, or at least the first formal element of that split in 1059. So, the Pope at the time saw this as an opportunity to potentially reunify Christendom. So the Pope was Urban II, and he makes a wonderful speech at an ecumenical council that was being held in Claremont. It was the last day of the council, so the council did its work. But then when its work was over, the Pope stood up and said, excuse me, said it's time to fight back against these Muslim hordes and liberate the holy city, protect pilgrims. And by the way, you do this wonderful corporal work of mercy and gain salvation, gain an indulgence for yourself. So he appealed to people's religious affiliation and then also their desire for eternal life in one speech, and got people highly impassioned. Okay, this was going to be an armed pilgrimage to save other Christians. It was going to be expensive. It was going to be dangerous. And the folks that took the cross, which was the term they used if you decided to go on a crusade, were expected to act as penitents, not as typical warriors. So rape and pillage is out, prayer and confession is in. Okay, so it was unusual from that perspective as well. Urban II actually gets a number of the princes of Europe to respond to this call. Unfortunately, they're not unified in their approach. They don't have a common strategy. They have no intelligence whatsoever on the land to which they were called, and they have no military plan for carrying out any such assault. So not a great start. He got people fired up. Urban got people fired up. But those people didn't happen to have the organization necessary to make this a reality. So with that, I'm going to take just a brief pause, and hopefully I'll be back in just a moment. So again, the Pope got everyone all fired up, but they knew nothing about the lands they were going to go to or travel across to get there. They really didn't have a plan. They're just like, let's go, right? And it took them a while to get ready to go, right? This wasn't like, hey, we're leaving on Tuesday. So you had some of the great princes of the European monarchies that were engaged. So not the kings, but their sons. And many other people, just commoners, decide to go. As a matter of fact, by the time these guys all got to the gateway into the Middle East, which was Constantinople, the largest Christian city in the world, there was well over 500,000 of them, and that totally flipped out Alexis. So, yeah, he wanted some help, but he didn't expect 500,000 people or more showing up on his doorstep. And he got a little nervous because now he's like, wait a second, these guys could wipe us out. Okay, so he actually called all these princes and demanded an oath of fidelity, made them promise that any land they recovered in the Middle East would actually go and default back to the Byzantine Empire. So even though they weren't part of that empire officially, he made them swear these oaths of allegiance to the Byzantine Empire and to agree that any land taken would go back to them, which again goes back to the misconception of it was a giant land grab. Really, the only people who are involved in the land grab might have been the king of Constantinople, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. He what he was looking for is he was looking for his land back, the land that the Muslim armies had taken from him and his family and the Byzantine Empire over the last 300-400 years prior to this. Anyway, May 1997, they get to the first city as they leave Constantinople and start traveling down into and towards Jerusalem. And maybe a map might be helpful here. So I want to find out if you can see. So Constantinople is here. Nicaea is here, right? So they went from Constantinople to Nicaea. So Constantinople's on the western side of the Bosphorus, which is this little outlet from the Black Sea. They were been ferried across by boat to this landmass over here, and then boom, onto Nicaea in 1097. Still well north of the of Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Anyway, they took Nicaea pretty easily, and the reason for that was the Seljuk king of Nicaea was out fighting another Muslim lord at the time. So his army wasn't there. He wasn't there to lead them. So Nicaea wasn't too difficult to take. He did return just as they entered the city, but at that point they were able to fortify it and stay across and stay there. They ended up securing the city, and then they decided to move forward. So they decided to start moving across the Anatolian desert, not knowing what a desert was. So the Crusaders, in their mind, they thought they would be like Europe, and they're gonna, as they're traveling, they're going to be able to use the forests to re-provision, meat and fruits and vegetables and things, not realizing that not only is there not meat and fruit and vegetable, there's no water. Okay, so it's called the Death March across the Anatolian desert because so many of the Crusaders died. So we're going through this area here, okay, from Nicaea down towards Dorylaeum. And Dorylaeum has an interesting pass in that when you come out of the pass, you're on high ground and you're looking down at a valley. Well, sure enough, when they get to that pass and look down the valley, they see an entire Muslim army, which was not expecting them and was not prepared to fight. So they pour into the valley, and it's a major victory, okay? Major victory at Dorylaeum. They were able to surprise a Muslim army. You didn't know they were coming, and it stunned the Muslim world. Now, for the first time, the Muslim world's a little bit on edge. So Christendom had gotten on edge, but the Muslim world really wasn't concerned about this crusade they had heard about. It wasn't until Dorylaeum that they got concerned. They move on to Antioch next, so another major city. So back to my map. So they go from Dorylaeum, they go south. Now we're heading towards Antioch. We're on the edge of Syria, at the edge of northern Israel. This is a big deal. Now we're starting to move into that narrow strip of very important land that separates northern and southern Islamic groups. So very big move to get to Antioch. And despite this treachery of the emperor of the Byzantines, Alexis I, who again invited these guys there, they were able to eventually take Antioch. And there's a couple of things that happened that allowed that to occur. I'll let you read about those for yourselves, but a couple of really combination of lucky and maybe even miraculous things that allowed Antioch to be taken just in time, despite Alexis, who brought his army to the fight, and then when saw it might not turn out the way it was supposed to, left. Okay, so he abandoned this large Christian crusading army, what was left of it. Probably about half it was gone already because they died in that death march from starvation and disease, not from being killed by the other armies. But Alexis leaves, a terrible thing to do. They take Antioch. Eventually, from there, now they are able to go to Jerusalem. And at that point, of the 500,000 or 600,000 that had arrived at Constantinople, they were down to 50 or 60,000. Only 1 or 10 were left after Antioch, okay, that could travel to Jerusalem. So a much smaller army actually is going to liberate the Holy City, but liberate it they did in July of 1099. So this took several years, but they get there. And after 460 years of Muslim captivity, Jerusalem is back in the hands of a Christian king. And they named one of the princes the king. There's a whole great story around that, but I don't have time to get too deep into it. Really read the book, either Belloc's book or Weidenkopf's book. It's really fascinating what happened there. So this first crusade did indeed liberate Jerusalem. It did indeed make it safe for pilgrims, and it did indeed cost the lives of almost everyone who went on it. Okay, so only 10% of the survivors stayed, so 2% of that original force, a very small group, okay, stayed. So say 5,000-6,000 men, that clearly wasn't going to be enough to hold it, to hold the lands and expand the lands 2,000 miles away from Europe. 80% never returned. They died primarily of starvation and disease and being unprepared for what life was like, or going to be like in the Middle East. So just, some positives, but also some stupidities and some real tragedies. Okay. In the interim period, so now, you got Jerusalem. What do you do? The Latin folks, the folks from Europe, realize, look, we're minorities here. They thought in their minds there were a lot of persecuted Christians, but what they found were a lot of Muslims and Jews, and especially in Jerusalem, and they realized that, boy, if we don't let freedom of religion reign here, we're going to be in trouble. So people will naturally listen to a political authority as long as there's peace and harmony and freedom. So they allowed for peace and harmony and freedom, which actually surprised subsequent pilgrims from the European nations, Latin pilgrims, because they were expecting to get to Jerusalem and find it being a Christian city. So they too were surprised now that you could pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but just because Christians took Jerusalem doesn't mean it was a Christian city. They did spend the next 5 decades doing, what was important, which is fortifying the edges of this land that they had captured. So they broke it into to geographic groups and had different princes controlling each of these geographic, I should say, regions. And the whole thing in total was called the Outremer. They also did a really smart thing. They built a series of forts along the Mediterranean on the western coast of what is today modern day Israel, so that they could control trade, at least maritime trade, in and out of this very important strip of land. So, and those were mostly fortified and defended by these military religious orders that you've heard of in legends: the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. Again, these were real groups that actually, served as sort of not just protectors, but even bankers. They would guard people's money who were on pilgrimage, because pilgrimage could take several years and you need to bring a lot of cash with you, and that would be exposing you to criminals along the way. So these night groups actually started saying, look, you deposit your money in Europe with our house there in Europe, and when you get to Israel, we will let you withdraw that money from our house in Israel. So basically the first international banking system. That was all good. So you had about 50 years where the Christians were able to hold the land and fortify it, until the rise of a gentleman by the name of Zengi. who began to do something that had been tried multiple times and had failed in the Muslim world. He began the unification of the Muslim world. His ultimate dream was to unify the complete northern and southern Muslim world under one caliph, one king. He was able to do it in the north. And because of that, he was also then able to retake Edessa pretty easily. So Edessa fell first. So that had been captured by the Christians in the First Crusade. So the Edessa region is up here. So the whole northern section of the land that the Christians had just taken, which was this strip that ran really from Edessa and Aleppo down to Ascalon, he just wiped out Edessa in one fell swoop. So that didn't take long to lose. And, you know, it also sent a message to the rest of the Muslim world. At least Zengi sought to send this message that, hey, these Christians aren't invincible. Yeah, they came in, they kicked our butts, but not because they were better, because we weren't prepared and we weren't expecting it. Now that we know and can fight back, and we can kick their butts. So he took a big chunk of the outrunner away and really emboldened the Muslim world. That led us to the Second Crusade. So when Edessa fell, the Pope at the time, Eugenius III, he said, hey, we got to do something. We got to go back and, you know, we can't let this land that we fought so dearly for fall back into Muslim hands. Let's go. And he issued a bull and, you know, tried to rise people up. He really thought the French were going to respond. He actually directed his bull to the French king. He got Bernard of Clairvaux to preach this crusade, to retake Edessa, and Bernard of Clairvaux was pretty effective. But the problem was we still had Jerusalem. So the initial, you know, religious desire, you know, to retake the holy city, well, we still had the holy city, and most people really didn't know much about Edessa. And strangely enough, Edessa at one point was one of the largest Christian cities in the world. So it's just ironic that they didn't know about Edessa. Excuse me for a minute while I pause. So again, while Edessa was really important, most of the people in Europe couldn't really associate with it. So the response to the Second Crusade was not the same. You did not have hundreds of thousands of people. Louis of France, Conrad of Germany, they did respond. So now you actually had kings going. So that was good. The Germans left first. They get to Constantinople in 1147. Emperor Emmanuel of Constantinople of Byzantine Empire, he was nervous again, seeing this large, heavily army arrive at his gates. And he says, yeah, I'll ferry you guys over, but he also wanted to hedge his bets. He's like, you know what, let me make a deal with the Turks at the same time. So he was simultaneously helping the Crusaders get to Turkey, what is modern day Turkey, so they could retake Edessa. And then he was feeding the Turks information about this army so that the Turks would be prepared when they arrived. And prepared they were, okay? Again, they figured, well, let's start with Nicaea. It worked the first time. They get to Nicaea, were able to take it, but then they were just attacked at Dorylaeum, just like that Muslim army was surprised, and they were destroyed, okay? They escaped back to Nicaea just as the French were getting there. So the French army arrives to what German coming bloodied and killed to Nicaea, and that wasn't a great sight. Okay, certainly didn't inspire the French army. They did regroup, and they in the spring of 48 they tried to march on Antioch, and they did. Okay. But we had an issue. Okay, they arrive at Antioch, which is still Christian held, but we had a little bit of a problem between the wife of the French king and Raymond, who was the king of Antioch. They had a little bit of an affair. And the wife of the French king wanted these armies, the unified German and French armies, to move on. And instead of going to Jerusalem right away, to go to Aleppo and then liberate Edessa. And that actually would have been a smart plan. Let me show you why. So they're here in Antioch. Where's Antioch? Right here. Okay. And what they're saying is, hey guys, you came here to free Edessa. So again, they had started in Nicaea, which was still under Christian control. They went to Dorylaeum. This is where the Germans got wiped out. Germans come back to Nicaea. They meet the French there. They move on to Antioch, which is still in Christian hands. So they kind of skirted around Edessa, the area that had been retaken. And the king of Antioch, who also happened to have at one point been the king of Edessa, said, hey, let's attack Edessa and Aleppo, and that will help us cut off the north from the south again, in which case that's a good strategic move. And with the help of his lover, the wife of the French king, he thought he could convince them to do that. That wasn't going to fly with the Crusaders, okay? So what they ended up doing was they decided, let's just bypass Jerusalem or bypass Edessa, and let's start by going to Jerusalem to reinforce it. So their idea was, we'll go to Jerusalem, we'll reinforce that to make sure that nothing else falls, and then we're going to go after Damascus. And again, not a terrible idea. Their thinking was that if they take Damascus, it would also cut off the north and the south, because now you couldn't travel along the eastern strip of this land because Damascus would block your trip, which means you'd have to either go out into the desert where you're likely to die, or you'd have to go through the main strength of the Christian armies along the thin strip of the coastland, in which case you're likely to die. So also not a terrible plan, but certainly not well executed. So they end up going to Damascus, and they were doing okay at Damascus. They were winning. They could have taken the city. When at some point they said, you know what? And there's a reason for this. Again, I'm going to reference you to go to the book, because I could spend an hour just talking about the rationale here. They moved their attacking position from the front of the city to the rear of the city. Huge mistake, because there was no access to food and water at the rear of the city. So they basically moved what was a very strong, stable, resource-rich attacking position to a very difficult attacking position with no access to resources, and with a Muslim army coming up behind them. They basically put themselves between the city and a Muslim army, as they didn't want the Muslims coming through the back door. That was part of the reason they moved. But in doing so, they trapped themselves without food and water. And as a result, they were soundly wiped out. And as a result of that, that's when Lewis and Conrad gave up. They said, this is not working. We're out of here. And they never went to Edessa. They returned to Europe with the tatters of their army, and all they did was serve to embolden the Muslim leadership, who said, look, they just gave us their best shot, and we just crushed them. We crushed this famous German and famous French army, okay? So not a good time, all right? Well, again, that didn't go over well in Europe. Some time passes. Saladin ends up doing what Zingy had started. So Zingy had started He had started the unification of the Muslim world. Saladin, who strangely enough was not a warrior, he was more of an accountant and lawyer and philosopher at the beginning. He became a tremendous warrior. He rose to power in Egypt, but he was from the northern Muslim tribe, strangely enough. So once he rose to power in Egypt, he was able to unify the north and the south, and that was a huge problem. So much of a problem that the king of Jerusalem saw this and realized, I have to go attack, okay? Because if I don't stop this now at its infancy, we're going to get wiped out. And he almost won, okay? He goes out and attacks. This is in 1077, okay? Goes out and attacks, almost gets Saladin. Actually, 1177, sorry. I have a typo there. Goes out and attacks Saladin. And this is the famous Baldwin IV, the leper king. You see him in the movie Kingdom of Heaven, portrayed as always wearing a silver mask because of his leprosy. By the way, that movie is terribly non-historical. Okay, so it's a beautiful movie, but it has not much to do with truth. But that's okay. It's entertainment, and that's fine. But it is where a lot of misconceptions about the Crusades come from that movie, unfortunately. But he almost had Saladin, but he let him go. And then when he dies in 1185, his handpicker's successor also dies a year later. Let me actually fix that typo while I can. I'm going to pause you for a moment. Okay, I fixed my typo. Let me catch back to 1177. Great. So his successor dies. So all of a sudden you have a power vacuum in Jerusalem, and our friend Saladin decided this is a good time to go and take Jerusalem again. Okay. So first he does a beautiful maneuver and fakes the Christians out into thinking there's a very small Muslim army that would be easy to defeat outside the city. So he draws them out first by attacking Tiberias with this small Muslim army, and then draws them out and draws them to a place called Hattin, which basically is where the mass majority of the Muslim army was in waiting. And once they got there, they got wiped out. The entire Jerusalem fighting force got destroyed. The true cross, which they would carry with them into battle, got taken. It was sent to Damascus and dragged through the streets, a real mud in your eye move for the Christians. Saladin was then able to attack Jerusalem, which had minimal defenses left. And here we are 88 years after the Christians had first taken it back. After almost 500 years of Islamic control, it's back under Islamic control. And you see the pieces of this in that movie about Kingdom of Heaven, but again, not very historically correct. All right. Well, once Jerusalem fell again, it was pretty easy to call another crusade. Okay. So the embarrassment or defeat at Hattin showed that the Muslim forces were strong. The humiliation of having the true cross dragged through the streets of the major Islamic city, Damascus, the fall of Jerusalem. We have Pope Gregory VII. He issues a bull in 1187, and you get the heavy hitters responding. So Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Richard the Lionhearted of England, of Robin Hood fame. Okay, this is why Richard had left England, and we get our wonderful legends around Robin the Hood. And also the King of France responds. So the king of the big three, Germany, England, and France, all respond. They coordinate. Okay, they coordinate. And they converge on Accra. Okay. If I can show you where that is on the maps. Yeah. So you can see Accra is a port city, basically in the center of the strip of land that we're after here. They converged there, which was a wonderful thing for them. Okay. And they meet the king of Jerusalem, who's now in exile. So Jerusalem had fallen into Islam hand. He had run to Accra. So remember, the Christians had fortified all these port cities, and he was fighting the Muslims at Accra, and they were sort of at a stalemate when the other armies arrived, and the Muslims, being smart, okay, said, "Hey, whoa, we got some new armies. We're at a stalemate. This is probably going to tip the balance of power." They immediately negotiated a settlement, which was typical in warring factions of that time. But they negotiated a settlement, and this settlement allowed Saladin to leave, to retreat. And he was supposed to hand over a bunch of Christian prisoners, and he was supposed to hand over Jerusalem. And as soon as he got out of Accra, he didn't do either thing. And as a result, this is when Richard the Lionhearted said, okay, and he wiped out the 2,700 Muslim prisoners that he was supposed to hand over to Saladin. So he had handed over the first half, but held the half back, waiting for Saladin to do his thing. Saladin never did it. He reneged on the deal, so he killed the other half. A pretty big, an evil thing to do, but I just want to give you some background as to why he did it. So they did take Accra back. They go to Jaffa, they take Ascalon. And strangely enough, at this point, it's pretty clear they could have taken Jerusalem. But, at this point, they've been away from Europe for several years. You're king of a country and you're away. You start hearing nasty things about the sheriff of Nottingham. Richard had to get back. Okay. As a matter of fact, the King of France had already left because he had some problems of his own domestically he had to deal with. So Richard said, let's just make a final negotiation with Saladin. And they did. they basically said, look, you keep Jerusalem, just give Christians the ability to get there and worship safely. Saladin said, okay. And then the crusading army left. Okay. And by the way, Saladin did actually come through on that one, but unfortunately, he died 6 months later. And 6 months later, he was replaced by someone who had no interest in keeping the terms of that negotiated settlement. And so hence the Third Crusade ended with little impact whatsoever, because it also marked the end of Saladin's time. Right. So Third Crusade sort of a waste. Again, I put the maps in here. Wonderful. So you can kind of see the travels. Feel free to study that in a bigger picture. See how they got there, how they came back. But that brings us now to the Fourth Crusade. So again, we're kind of back to where we were before the First Crusade, except there's this thin strip of land that's controlled by these port cities under Christian kings. The Fourth Crusade is called by Innocent III. Again, he is promising, earn your salvation, do all sorts of good things. It's a complicated time in Europe. Nation states are really starting to gain some traction. So you don't really have too many political leaders who are that eager to leave their country because they're just starting to form it and they want to defend it. So it's a tough time for a pope to call a campaign. He does get some people to go, okay, but they're like minor lords and dukes and things of that nature. The kings have no interest because they're starting to see their lands really solidify and they'd like to continue that process. They decide that they're going to go to Alexandria first, so they're going to approach the Middle East from northern Egypt instead of going through Constantinople, as that has proven to be difficult because it requires that desert march through Dorylaeum. So they decide to go to Alexandria, but in order to do that, you have to cross the Mediterranean Sea, which means you need boats. So they go to the people who have boats, who are the Venetians, and they have the major fleet in the world. They are a separate nation, okay, the country of Venice at the time. And they're like, sure, you can use our boats. This is how much it's going to cost you. But all these dukes and minor lords didn't have that kind of money. The Pope certainly didn't have that kind of money. So they really can't pay. So the Venetians make them a deal. They said, well, I'll tell you what. We'll let you have a discounted rate if you attack Zara on the way. And Zara was another major fleet country. It was actually controlled by a Christian, the king of Hungary. And they figured, well, if we can knock out Zara as a competitive port city, we're control all the merchant business in the Mediterranean. So Leah, you guys attack Zara. We'll give you the boats and you owe us some money. But you do that, you wipe out our competitors, and we're in good shape. Well, the leader of this crusade, Theobald, he was against it. So Count Theobald, a French count, but he dies, and the remaining leaders are sort of desperate to get going, so they say sure. And here it is: a Christian army goes and attacks a Christian city. Well, I guess that takes. They figured maybe we could attack another. And at this point, the deposed emperor of Constantinople, his son, approaches them and says, look, we were thrown out of Constantinople. The people of the city love me. You helped me get Constantinople back. And I'll make sure that you get the money you need because we're super rich in Constantinople. And you'll be able to pay the Venetians what you owe them, and then we'll be able to get you on your way to the Middle East so you can recover Jerusalem fully and restore the Outremer to its First Crusade heyday. So they buy into that. They get to Constantinople, and they are amazed by the sheer size and beauty and riches of it. And they're also surprised that no one in the city wants the emperor's son back. So they got sold the bill of goods, thinking they'd be welcomed as heroes, bringing the unfairly deposed emperor's son back, and they're like, yeah, no interest, you can keep him. All right. Well, they attack the city because now they're in desperate shape. They owe the Venetians a boatload of money. They got to get it somehow. They got this promise that if they bring Alexis back to power, he'll give them all the money they need. So they attack the city. they would have lost, but the emperor, the current emperor who had deposed the previous emperor, got scared and at the last minute left the city. When he left the city, his army kind of lost faith, and the tides turned, and this large crusading army entered the city. They proceeded to sack the city, okay, because Alexis immediately reneged on the deal after he's returned to power. So he got killed. Okay, another coup. And this crusading army just said, forget it. And they took their riches and the payment they needed to the Venetians by taking everything of value from Constantinople and dragging it back to Europe. And they gave the Venetians, as I mentioned very early on, a very nice gift of the 4 horses that currently reside over St. Mark's as a show of good faith. They stole that from Constantinople as just a sign saying, look, we're good for paying our debts. As a matter of fact, some interesting religious relics were stolen from Constantinople, including the remnants of the True Cross, the crown of thorns, and what I consider the most important relic that they stole, which was the Shroud of Turin. This is how the Shroud of Turin got to Turin eventually. It was stolen from Constantinople, where it had been for several hundred years after being taken from the city of Edessa by force. So again, some weird connections in the Fourth Crusade. And at that point, the Crusaders said, we've had enough, and they went home. So they never even went to Jerusalem. All they did was attack Zara, a pretty large Christian port city, and then they went and totally destroyed and ransacked the largest Christian city in the world, Constantinople. So you're talking about folly and stupidity and greed. That's the Fourth Crusade. Then you had the Fifth and Sixth Crusades, also called by Innocent. He was totally flipped out by what happened with the third one, so he tried twice more. They failed. Okay. No one had interest anymore. It took forever for them to even make any headway on one of the minor cities in the Outremer, Damietta. It all fell apart. Okay. At one point, the Muslims actually said, this is annoying. Okay. You guys keep attacking. We're not that fond of Jerusalem anyway. You can have it. But they're like, no, we're going to fight you for it. And they're like, well, we're willing to give it to you. Just leave. And they're like, no, we're going to fight you for it. Well, that was stupid. Okay, so they had it twice. This is where, strangely enough, a little oddity of Catholic history, St. Francis of Assisi arrives. His thought was, I'm going to end the Crusades because they're terrible. And I'm going to do it by talking to the Caliph of the Muslims, the Muslim Lord, and convert him to Catholicism. And he actually makes his way all the way to the Caliph. And the Caliph is like, wow, this guy is bold. I'm going to have to kill him, but he's bold. But he says, I'll listen to him first. And after listening to Francis and his merry band of friars, he says, well, you guys certainly are gutsy. You're certainly insane. And I appreciate you trying to save me, but I'm pretty good with the religion I have. So I'm not going to kill you, but I am going to send you home. So he patted Francis on the head, sent him back to Europe. The crusade continued. They tried to attack Al-Kamil. He was the one who had met with Francis at Mount Sirah. Mount Sirah, if you look at the maps, is down here in very northern Egypt, lower Middle East. So again, they really had started down here as opposed to up here again. They attack him at Mount Sirah. They lose everything. They have to fall back onto Damietta. Again, Frederick finally comes at the end, the Sixth Crusade, and his crusade wasn't a crusade at all. He never fought a battle. He brought his army and said, let's just negotiate. And he negotiated a deal where he says, you know what? We're fighting for you, Al-Kamil, against the people that are rebelling in your world. And if we fight for you and you win with our help, what we'd like you to do is just give us a few more concessions in Jerusalem so that our people are more able to visit when they want. And that's what they did. They fought for the Muslim army in the Sixth Crusade against another Muslim army, helped out Al-Kamil, and they got some minor concessions and went home. And that leads us to the very sad end of the Crusades with St. Louis. He tries. He gets to Damietta again. He also tries this Egyptian approach. Tries to go after Cairo, figuring if he can take Egypt, he once again cuts the Muslim world in half. But he allowed his supply lines to get cut again at Mansourah. We don't learn any lessons apparently as Christians. He retreats. He doesn't even make it back. His army is wiped out during the retreat. He negotiates a deal. He ends up staying on in the Outremer for a couple of years, trying to fortify it and trying to unify people to fight for the land. But he ends up returning to Europe a couple of years later, accomplishing absolutely nothing. Um, uh, Again, second time. Now he decides, okay, I got to go back because there's this crazy guy Baibars who's now controlling the Muslim army. He's unified the north and the south, so he's undoing any little help or any little effort that or any little gain that the French king had achieved. He's systematically wiping out one Christian city after another in that thin strip. Wipes out every single person in Antioch. Okay, so this was the major tragedy of the Crusades. Women, children, animals, nothing was left living. Louis now decides, I got to go back. This is an affront to Christianity, but he's at the time pretty old for the age. He's 53. He ends up dying of disease. He never actually gets past Carthage. Matter of fact, his fleet, after his death, they tried to return to France, and the fleet got caught in a storm and itself fell apart. And it basically was the end of that dynasty of French kings. So total disaster from beginning to end. And there's the maps of those crusades, including the disastrous French crusade that never really got anywhere, and ended up in the death of the King Louis, Saint Louis, and really just the final death blow to the Outremer. At that point, it was just that narrow strip along the coast, with Accra being the biggest port city. And eventually the Muslims had a good excuse to attack that, and they did. And even though the Christians fought, basically the Accra fell. And once Accra fell, that was the end. The other port cities fell in rapid succession thereafter. And here we are at the end of the 13th century, right back where we started prior to the beginning of the Crusades. Everything is back in Muslim control. Hundreds of thousands, likely somewhere in the range of maybe 1.5 million people died, and nothing was gained or lost by either side. And if anything, it was more of an irritant to the Muslims, who were trying to unify themselves this whole time and they kept getting distracted to fight off these Christian armies. But the Ottoman Empire now did unify the Muslim world, led by Osman, and he decided, you know what, I don't want the Christians ever bothering us again. So he decides, okay, from now on, we are just going to systematically start taking Christian lands. And if you remember that animated map, you can see they went around Constantinople and started taking southeastern Europe piece by piece. And they had really done a great job. They pushed into the Balkan states by the late 14th century, so the end of 1300s, and they were on their way. Okay, and that's when we had Mehmet, the blood drinker. He becomes sultan in the 15th century. He did not get that nickname for nothing. He was brutal, and he continued this devastation of the Christian cities. One of his great leaders, Mehmet, he actually arrives at Constantinople in the mid 15th century with more artillery than had ever been assembled, and basically knocked Constantinople out. So Constantinople had been surrounded by the Muslim world, and Mehmet said, that's the end of Constantinople. He took it. And once Constantinople failed, all of a sudden now the popes got nervous again, Pope Pius II, and he called a crusade. No one came, so he decided to go himself. Huge mistake. So he's the Pope that took the cross. So he tried what would have been the Seventh Crusade, but he died along the way pretty rapidly. So never really got off the ground. And that just further emboldened the Muslims. So now you're up to Suleiman, the 10th Sultan, born in the 10th month on the 10th century of the Muslim era. 10's a big number in Islam. So this guy was seen to be like, hey, he's the guy. 10th guy, 10th month, 10th century. And he decides it's time. We're going to wipe out Christendom once and for all. And we're going to start by taking the Mediterranean Sea. In order to do that, they had to take the island of Malta. The island of Malta was defended by the Hospitallers. Their general Grand Master, he was 70 years old at the time, leading a band of other old guys. So this is the battle of old guys against the Muslim army. They actually hold out for quite some time, 3 months, okay? And the Muslims would eventually have won. However, the Hospitallers had sent out a call for help, and strangely enough, even though no one replied to their call, the Spanish did intend to reply. Their reply just got lost, never got to the Hospitallers. So the Hospitallers weren't even aware that someone had replied and was on their way. So they were holding out against no hope. They were just determined to fight to the death, thinking all would be lost. And then lo and behold, what shows up but a Spanish fleet behind the Muslim fleet, just as the Muslims would have been on the verge of taking what was left of Malta. And instead, the tired Muslim army got destroyed by this Spanish fleet. So this first foray of taking all of Christendom back failed at Malta because of the Spanish fleet. They just decided to try again. This time it's at Lepanto. So Lepanto is an amazing port city that is very easy to defend because the winds naturally come out of the port. So for any army or armada that tries to sail into this port city, it gets naturally pushed back by the prevailing winds. So what the Muslims decided to do was build the largest fleet ever assembled there because it was easy to defend it while it was being built. As it was being built, they were very vocal about what they intended to do with it. Okay, so this is in the Gulf of Corinth. Maybe I can show it to you on the map. Do we actually have Lepanto called out here? I don't think we do, strangely enough. So Corinth, and I don't have Lepanto. I thought I did. Sorry about that. I need to get a different map. Well, I think you'll see it in a moment. So this is in the 16th century now, so we're getting pretty close to reality. So remember, all these crusades started around the year 1000. They really were wiped out by the 1300s. Now you have the Muslim Empire re-encroaching and taking Christian lands once again. We finally see the fall of Constantinople. And now we see major attacks with the intention of taking Europe in its entirety. They don't think they can lose. The Pope at the time, Pius V, he says, we got to do something. Okay, Spain responds. The Papal States, the Pope owned quite a bit of land in Italy, it responds. And Venice again, which was its own independent country and had a pretty substantial fleet, they respond. So between the Venice fleet and the Spanish fleet, they had a pretty substantial armada, but it was still outshipped 3-1 and outmanned 4-1. So you're talking about a pretty desperate situation. This relatively large armada is going to go against a massive one that had many more people. The leader of this fight was Don Juan. So historically, Don Juan, lots of legends, good-looking man, but he was a real guy. And he was given a bunch of religious artifacts. He was given a beautiful image of Our Lady of Guadalupe from the King of Spain, who really had a devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico. The Pope himself made sure that every man that boarded these ships was given a rosary. Images of Our Lady are everywhere on these ships. They're thinking Our Lady is going to lead us to victory. What really was going to lead them to victory may have been Our Lady, but it was also Don Juan, because Don Juan had an idea. And Don's idea was brilliant. Okay. So, up until this point, if you're in a naval battle, the way you would fight it was you'd have a bunch of cannons at the front of your ship. You'd point your ship at what you were shooting at, another ship, and blow it out of the water. And Don Juan was like, you know, what stinks about this is you can only fit 4 or 5 cannons at the front of a ship. If we could put the cannons on the side of the ship, we'd be in much better shape. And he decided to prove that in the Battle of Lepanto by building a bunch of barges that had cannons on their sides, on both sides, that they could tug behind the ships. And what they did was then they go to Lepanto, and strangely enough, as they're arriving there was a change in the wind. For one of the first times in recorded history, the wind was blowing into Lepanto. So all of a sudden, this Spanish and Papal State and Venetian armada arrived. This is where there is a little bit of divine intervention. The winds changed, so it made it easy for them to enter this enclosed area of Lepanto. The Muslim Armada is not at all afraid of this, because they realize they outnumber them, so they're surprised to see them entering. They're also then believe that the Christian Armada got scared, because they see the Christian Armada start to turn suddenly, and in a way it looks like they're turning to turn around and run away, but what they're doing is they're turning so these barges are now facing the Muslim Armada. And before the Muslims knew what was happening, most of their Armada was blown to pieces by this brilliant strategic move from Don Juan. And then the rest of the battle continued with a huge advantage for the Christians. And ultimately, the Muslim fleet was destroyed almost in its entirety. Strange little side note. It's reported that the Pope, the day of this battle, the Pope was back in Rome, thousands of miles away. And in the middle of a meeting, rose up, went to the windows, looked out the windows, and then turned around and declared to the cardinals in this meeting, "We have won the Battle of Lepanto. Praise be Mother Mary and our Lord Jesus Christ." And they're all like, "Well, how would you know that? You clearly didn't see it from the window." Because that's thousands of miles away. But sure enough, 2 weeks later, the news actually arrived that yes, he was right. The Christian Armada had won the Battle of Lepanto, and Christianity was saved once again. But there's still one more chance. So this time, new Mehmet decides, you know what, it didn't work in Malta. It didn't work at Lepanto. Let's get away from the water. Let's just go the easy route. And let's go from Turkey right through Vienna, because if we can take Vienna, it's the northeasternmost major city in Europe. And if we open up the gateways of Vienna, we are now able to go both north and south in Europe, and there's nothing that can stop us. So he arrives at Vienna with 100,000 troops. This is in the late 17th century, so pretty modern times. Vienna was not prepared. Okay. Only had 13,000, drastically or rapidly calls for help from all the Christian kings. The only one that responds is the Polish king, but it took him a long time to get there. So he had stopped at a couple Marian shrines on the way and prayed and prayed. And this delay actually led Mehmet to believe that no one was responding. So Mehmet didn't really think much about or wasn't worried at all about Christian armies coming from Europe. And so he left his rear guard unguarded. The result of that was when the Polish army arrived, they came up behind the Muslim army, which had just about wiped out the army of Vienna, was about to enter the city, and slowly started eating away at the back of the Muslim army. And it wasn't until half of it was destroyed that Mehmet realized that he was under attack from behind. And at that point, it was too late. He was caught between the walls of Vienna and the Polish army. And that was pretty much it. His entire army got wiped out. And this was the beginning of the fall of the Ottoman Empire here in the late 17th century. The Ottoman Empire continued to exist for a couple hundred more years. But eventually, it too fell. And its last great hurrah was with World War I when it fought on the side of the Germans. So obviously they picked the wrong side. And that was the end of the Ottoman Empire. As Germany was defeated, the Ottoman Empire was disbanded. And this is when you get the colonialism everyone associates with the Crusades, as the European countries took pieces of the Ottoman Empire and dissected it. So someone took Egypt, someone took Jordan, someone took Syria. So strangely enough, where the Crusades had all failed at putting Christian kings in power, it was actually the failure of the Seljuk Turks or their successors, the Ottomans, that led ultimately to Christian kings being in power. So strangely enough, the Crusades, again, it was born out of a period that we have a hard time understanding. Religious alliances, religious dedication was much more powerful. There weren't nation states like we know them today. So you weren't French or Italian or German. You were Christian or you were Islamic or you were Jewish. So you fought for your religion, okay, and you were more incentivized by affronts to your religion than you ever would have been by affronts to your nation state. That rapid spread of Islam and the devastating tactics of the Turks, the Seljuk Turks, who were the successors of the Huns, crystallized that initial Christian response. That first crusade was actually pretty successful, despite itself, no planning, heavy losses. But the reality of war is something that man learns over and over again because we're too stupid to remember anything. Is that you can't actually hold on to land that you take so far away from your base of operations and your supply line. So trying to hold land 2,000 miles away, very difficult unless you take all of the land, and they didn't. So it was destined to fail. All those subsequent efforts were just one failure after another. And quite frankly, from Christianity's perspective, were a huge big deal, but from Islam's perspective, were more of an irritant than anything else. Okay. Ultimately, it was dilution of bloodlines, resupply problems, the centralization of the Muslim, the North and South, that organization and unification, that Jerusalem just was destined to fall again. And by the way, after that, it was an heroic effort to just hold on to Europe under the attack of the Ottomans. But strange enough, in the end result of all of this was strangely enough the colonization and the destruction of the Muslim Empire following World War One. Okay, so World War One, when the Ottoman Empire, which was the glue that held the Muslim Empire, the Muslim world together, when it fought on the side of Germany as its last-ditch effort to hold on to some semblance of power, with the loss in World War One, the Ottoman Empire was completely dismantled, and Europe cut up pieces of it and took it for themselves. So just so ironic of what ended up happening at the very end. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of the Crusades, a better understanding of what they really were. I'm sure I could have covered some elements a little bit more clearly, but with limited time, that's what you get. If you have questions, those two books that I reference are two of the best. There's a bunch of other ones. Most of them aren't worth the paper they're written on, as they were written from a perspective that really had no concern for the real history. We're more concerned of portraying the Crusades. And strangely enough, most of the movies about the Crusades you've seen were all based on those very non-historical books. Historians today would probably recommend the books I've recommended, or there are a couple others that are more scholarly works that are just as good from an historical perspective. I'd encourage that if you really want to know more. There's not an historian on the planet today that would give you the traditional story of the Crusades. They'll give you the story I just gave you now, which is a combination of sad and ironic and predictable, and a product of its times. But hopefully you get to see what that is. And next time someone starts chiming off about the Crusades and and painting Christianity in a negative light through the Crusades. Hopefully, you have enough to know that, yeah, while some of that might be deserved, there's enough problems for it to go around for everybody. And actually, there's some big positives that came out of the at least the first crusade. And there was some real honorable reasons for that crusade. So hopefully you'll be able to share that as well. But feel free to share all the uglies of it, the good, the bad, and the uglies. And I hope this was enjoyable. So thank you very much, and let's end in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, as always, thank you for the chance to explore our history. Our history is very rich, and with any rich history, you have major points of beauty and major points of ugly. And this was certainly more ugly than beautiful, and more tragic than glorious. We ask that you remind us and help us learn lessons from this, that I think we may have learned finally, but also allow us not to be afraid of studying this period of our history and sharing it in a truthful way, as opposed to the way it's often shared, which is used as a bludgeon to belittle Christians, and specifically Catholics. So help us have the strength to not let that occur anymore. And we ask this in your holy name. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. And I hope to see you at one of the next live Elevate talks, again, hopefully with season 6. And feel free to come to as many as you like, or feel free to keep watching these videos. Take care. Bye-bye.